Hello everyone. In this video we're going to be talking about the pattern tools that are available to us in our sketch menu and in our create menu. These are wonderful for quickly generating multiple objects if we want them in a particularly static pattern. So if we want them in a rectangular pattern or a circular pattern, around a point or in a particular number of spacings apart, we'll be able to do this quickly and efficiently. I will mention there are two different versions. The first version is within the create menu for 3D objects, and so rectangular pattern is available, circular pattern is available. The third one is not available in sketches but is available in 3D space, and essentially it's similar, where you can design a path with a sketch of some kind and then create objects along that path. The fourth option, though it would be really nice to be able to use, unfortunately right now it is locked behind a module that we don't have, and so we are not going to pay money at this point to be able to use that, so we will not discuss that one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a very simple shape and be able to and draw my sketch on top of it, and then I'll go ahead and cut through that with my pattern. So the first step is to create our object. I'm going to select create sketch button. I'm going to select my plane, so I'm looking top down. When I create my rectangle, instead of having it starting the corner here and pulling out, I'm going to center it. So instead of using a plain 2-point rectangle, I'm going to choose from the submenu a center rectangle. One thing to note as we make it, it has what are called construction lines crossing it, and essentially construction lines are reference points or reference objects, so lines, shapes, anything can be a construction where it becomes dotted, and essentially they're a reference so we can select them, use them for constraints, use them as center points or connecting values, but they don't affect the end result of what we can select when we move into 3D. That's the only kind of real difference, and I'll show you briefly how that shows up in app practice. So I'm going to make my square 100 by 100. It is centered on the origin and symmetric because it is even in a square. So there it is. Notice as I hover over it, it's still one single object. If I were to select one of these construction lines and make it no longer construction, so back to a regular line, when I hover over, notice it recognizes it as split in half as two separate things. If I were to temporarily finish this sketch and try to extrude, notice that this triangle is separate. I can actually do them individually or at the same time. If I wanted to do both at the same time, then I'd have to select both halves of that rectangle because that line was no longer construction. This other one, though it is a line, it's not really visible to the 3D realm because it's only there as kind of a helper for information in the sketch. So that's the key difference between these. So I'm going to go back into my sketch and make that line construction because I do not want it in two halves. I do want to keep it. And the reason it made it for the center point is it just guarantees that you have a center point at all times when you make your center point rectangle. You could do this with a regular rectangle and manually drag construction lines across. We will do that in a little bit, but it's convenient for us when we use the center point rectangle. So now that I'm done, it's one object. I'm going to extrude it. Again, this is just kind of so we have an object to play with. 10 millimeter sheet or square. I'm going to select the top surface and create a new sketch on this one, and I'm going to go ahead and make. I'm going to use a circle. What my goal is going to be is to use a rectangular pattern that kind of spreads circles evenly across the space. And my goal is going to be I want the outer circles, any circles on the outside, to be 5 millimeters from the edge of the circle to the walls, and then between the circles, except the last ones, I want 10 millimeters between them. And so that's not perfectly evenly distributed, but it is evenly distributed within the center of all the circles, and then on the edges they're a little bit closer to the sides. So first things first, I'm going to choose a circle. So here's my diameter circle. Doesn't matter where I put it. I'm going to select it. I'm going to make mine 10 millimeters in size. I'm going to move it so that this top line, this edge, is not tangent, but 5 millimeters away. So that would imply that since this is a circle and the diameter is 10, that I would have to include this 5. So a total of 10 millimeters from the center point to the edge. I'm going to use my dimensioning tool, select the center, select one of the edges, and choose 10 millimeters. And now it's locked there. It's still not fully constrained because I can move it side to side. And so in a similar fashion, I'm going to go ahead and do another dimension from the center to this side, also 10. And now we can see that it is fully constrained because I can no longer move it. It's tied 10 away from the center to the edge on this side, and it's 10 in diameter. There's nothing about this circle that is unknown anymore. So the next step is, okay, great. I could do this again and again and space them out, do the distance between each circle. But again, the pattern tool is what really makes this kind of fly in terms of how quickly we can make it happen. So if we look at this create menu, we see here there's only two options, circular pattern and rectangular pattern. We're going to select rectangular pattern. Again, just like with everything in Fusion, I could select the object I want to manipulate and then choose the tool, or I could choose the tool and then the object. I chose the tool first, so notice it asked me, okay, well, what do you want to use what do you want to make the pattern out of? So it's got to, in a sketch, it's got to be some kind of closed shape. Or actually, that's not true. It has to be any geometry, so I could choose a line as long as there's some geometry to it. I'm going to select a circle. As soon as I do this, you'll notice a bunch of symbols show up. These are useful. So you can decide, do you want to type in numbers? Do you want to drag arrows? They are connected to each other. If you do one, you are doing the other. And it's just a matter of what you're comfortable with. I typically use the arrows first just to kind of see it happening, and then I adjust the numbers in the boxes as I go. Notice there are two arrows, and they also point in particular directions. The direction they're pointing is the positive direction for our distances. So when I pull down, that's a positive number for the distance. If I were to drag upward, it would be a negative number. Likewise, if I were to pull to the left, it would be a positive number for the horizontal and negative if I go to the right. In this situation, I am going to go to the right, so if I drag, we will see negative distances in our menu. One final thing to note, our distribution affects how this spacing occurs. And there are two options. The first is extent, the second is spacing. If you read what it says, essentially, extent means if you give us a set distance, and however many objects are in this example for the first one going to the left to right, however many objects there are, they must be equally spaced across that distance from whatever the point is. So for our circles, what it's saying is, for example, if you have a distance of 10, then the center points of all the objects, in this case 3 by default, must be evenly spaced within that 10 millimeters, right? So we can see this in a moment, how this is going to work. So I'm going to actually drag, and you'll see that as I do it, it gives me kind of a preview of where these circles in the pattern would show up. So notice I'm at negative 25. I'm going to go to when it's exactly flush. So these are all tangent to one another on their edges. And notice the number I ended up with was 20 millimeters. Negative 20 because it's to the right, but 20 is the actual magnitude. And so if we think about this, we're saying across all 20 millimeters, you must fit evenly the center points of these circles or this shape. So again, it's not the full circles because that's way more. Because if each of these circles has 10 in diameter, if we add them up, that's 30. What it is the center point. So if we notice from the center point to its edge, if the diameter is 10, the radius is 5. So 5 from the center to the edge. From the edge to the center is another 5, that's 10 total. From the center to the edge is another 5, that's 15. From the edge to the center is 20. So the extent of our distance is 20. That white line is basically that extent. And it says, hey, can you space them out within the 20? That is one choice for our stretching of our patterns. The second choice is spacing. And so spacing, what it says is, whatever number you give, that's how much space should be in between these shapes within our pattern. Right? So that's useful, and it depends on what you're trying to do. I often use spacing, but there's no hard and fast rule about what's better. Sometimes, particularly if you're doing it visually, it's kind of arbitrary. But I'll show spacing just so we can see it. And so now we're saying how much space should be between each of these points. And in fact, nothing changed. And if we think about why, if the distance is 10 millimeters, well, actually, what changed was the number. If I go back to extent, it's 20, but if I go to spacing, it's 10. And because if you think about it, we're saying there should be 10 millimeters between points on our circles. So from center to edge is 5, from edge to center is 10. So there's 10 between these two. So they end up being the same thing with different amounts. If I were to go to 20, like it was before, now suddenly we say, okay, well, there's 5 to here. That's a radius of 5. There's a radius from here to here, which is 5. So that means there must be 10 between the edges. That's a total. So there's 10 millimeters between each of them, plus the radiuses, which gives us a total of 20 millimeters between center points. And so we can decide how we want to do this. I'm actually going to increase. I don't want 3. I want it to go kind of across the entire square. So I think I'm going to put 5. My quantity is 5. This white arrow, if you notice, if I drag it, it takes less if I go right, and if it goes this way, it's more. So this is the same thing as using the number. So I don't typically drag this. I don't particularly care for it. So I like to type in 5 for my quantity. And so there they are. And I think this is what I wanted. I said from edge to edge is 5 millimeters, and then from edge to here is 5. That's a total of 10. That makes sense. And then between these is 10 millimeters. So the ones in the middle have a little more gap, but on the sides there's 5. Right? And so there it is. The final results being the distance is 20 between them, between each center point. And so a final kind of point for the direction, and again, I've only been focusing on going horizontally. In fact, you'll notice quantity, distance, and direction are duplicated because that is for the vertical pattern section. So I'm just working on the horizontal right now. But this direction option, just like what we had seen in some other tools, we can do symmetric. And essentially what it does is instead of spreading them out in one direction, it tries to evenly space them out. So if I do symmetric, you'll notice that half of them would end up on this side, half of them on the right. And so for this situation, it doesn't work out because I didn't center my circle. If I had put my circle right in the middle, then symmetric might have been the good choice. But because I put it in the corner, because of how I did my measurements, then the opposite, one direction, is the better choice. So this is what I'm happy with. And so if I want to duplicate it across this square, because I made a square and everything is going to be equal in distances, then I'm going to simply do the same thing for the vertical direction. So there it is 5. You don't notice them because there's no distance. If I go ahead and drag or type in the number, in this case, because it's down, it's positive 20, we can see they get automatically populated and spaced out. The last thing I'll say in this pattern is this checkbox called suppression. And so what suppression says is that if it's checked, we'll see a checkbox on every single shape in our pattern, and we can actually disable different parts of our pattern. So perhaps I realize the pattern is great, but I want the middle open. So I'm actually going to do that. I'm going to select suppression. Notice they all get a checkbox. I'm going to uncheck that middle. I'm going to suppress its visibility, and now it's no longer part of the pattern. You'll notice the square is still there, so I could easily bring it back, but it's no longer part of it. And once I click OK, it won't be there, but the rest of them will. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And here we go. And there it is. And you can see on my surface are all those circles. I didn't have to measure them. I didn't have to do it. I did some math, but not as much as if I had manually placed them and drawn them again and again and again. And that middle one is missing, which is convenient. So I don't have to worry about how much space was there. It's calculated and simply disappears as I uncheck it. As a final step, the only tedious part I would say is I have to select all the circles if I want to remove them or cut them out or extrude them. So I'm going to do that real quick. Oh, I missed. There we go. Here we go. Now, there might be a quick way to do this. I'm not sure of it off the top of my head, so if someone knows, that would be great to find out about. And I'm going to hit E or the extrude button. I'm going to drag down so it starts to cut through, and then I'll switch my extent type to all so it cuts all the way to the bottom without having to figure out the actual distance. Click OK, and there we are. Our pattern is cut through, and then we have a little kind of box with these holes in it, right? So this is great. We'll do one more, and this will be easy enough because we're simply going to do the same thing, but we're going to do a radial pattern or circular pattern to make this happen. So likewise, I'm going to do just like I did before. I'm going to choose a sketch plane. I'm going to choose that same bottom sketch. This body's in the way. I don't want to draw on the surface of this body, so I'm going to hide it temporarily. So I'm going to click on this. Oops, I did not mean to do that. I'll hit undo. I'll open up bodies, hide the first body. It's still there, but it's just invisible. I'll make a new sketch. I'll pick the bottom plane, and here I am again. And then I can bring this one back just so we can see it as we do stuff. I'm going to go ahead and make another rectangle. I'll choose center point rectangle like before. And now, unfortunately, I don't have kind of the origin to do that on, but I'm going to roughly put it somewhere here. Thankfully, I can kind of snap it to the axis as I move along. I'll choose this. I'll do the same thing, 100 millimeters by 100 millimeters. There are my construction lines. I'm happy with this sketch. I'm going to go ahead and finish. I'm going to extrude it, and I'm going to go 10, so it goes up 10 millimeters. There's our same kind of object. I'll select its surface. I will sketch on its surface. And this time around, I'm going to do a rectangle. Now, there's one problem. Unfortunately, I used a center rectangle to make this sketch, but or make this object after I extruded it. But unfortunately, those construction lines that were helpful getting the center point are no longer available. So I'm going to draw my own construction lines that are diagonal across the middle to make this easier. So I'm going to go ahead and do this. I'm going to use the line tool. I'm going to select line type, and I'm going to choose construction. And I'll drag from the top left to the bottom right, the top right to the bottom left, and there it is. And then one last step, because even though they're crossing, there is no center to select. We didn't notice it, but it was in fact there. There was a point in the middle, and I'm going to do the same. I'm going to choose point from my create menu, and I'm going to go right there. Thankfully, because they are crossing, notice it gives me that kind of midpoint right on both lines, and there it is. So now I have a center point. Now that I have this, here we go. If you're going to do a circular pattern, the way it's going to work is instead of having a grid, we're going to have a center point that things revolve around. And so we have to figure out how far we want things. So I'm going to choose a rectangle this time. So I'm going to do, again, a center point rectangle. I'm going to just draw it here. I'll make it 15 by 15. Actually, no, that's too big. Let's do 10 by 10. There it is. I'm going to drag it. I want it to be in a straight line down the middle, so I actually might have to do it. Well, I'll do a distance first. I'll go ahead and say the dimensioning tool and say from the center to the center, I want a total distance of 15. And so there it is. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a pattern out of this thing. Let me hit escape to get rid of my dimensioning tool. I'm going to go to the create menu, circular pattern. Very similar. I didn't select the object. I'm going to, oh, I did make one mistake. Notice my rectangle is totally construction lines. I did not mean to do that. I should probably select all 4 of these lines, and that was a mistake on my part, and make them no longer construction. There we go. And there are construction lines between them, but those are not construction lines. That is what I expect, because that way I can select the square if I need to. I'm going to do my circular pattern. My object is in fact a square. I can double click on it to get the edge around it. And here's this difference. Here I have a center point selection. I'm going to choose this center point. That's why I had to create it. And notice the preview. There it is. It says, hey, we're going to put boxes around here. Do you want to do this? And radially says, basically, if you have 360 degrees, evenly distribute them by default. Same thing, we have suppression. We can check those or not check them. Quantity, how many? So let's do 5 just to see it. There they are, evenly spaced. The real difference here is for our distribution, we can choose full, partial, or symmetric. Symmetric I'm not going to mess with. Partial basically says instead of 360 degrees, how many degrees do you want? And so for example, 180 degrees, it says, well, from here to here is 180 degrees. You have 5 things, evenly space them in the less number of degrees. So I'm going to go back to full just so we can see it. There it is, evenly spaced. I'm going to click OK. There they are. I'm going to click finish my sketch. Beautiful. And my last step. And notice that these are blue, so I must have not constrained them in some fashion, but that's not a big deal for us. I'm going to go ahead and select them all. And I'm going to extrude them. So I'm going to rotate. I'm going to go ahead and pull up, and I'll pull up 35. And there they are. I'll click OK. And there they are. So a radial pattern, great for a lot of things, just like the rectangular pattern. You decide what's appropriate for what you're aiming to do. You can do all kinds of things with them. It really is a great tool. So I'll see you in the next video.